Alright, so in this single tutorial, I want to mention and show um, how to check to see if your rig is stable. Right, so this tutorial is about double checking to see if your rig is stable. Right. Right now I have multiple rigs. Alright, I'm gonna press H to hide. And over here, you could see that I have my letter R, right? R animation controllers, R bone, R mesh, and they're all color coded. The bones are set to reference. The mesh is also set to reference for the letter R. Then I have I, and the eyes are color coded. The bones are referenced, not referenced, but yeah, referenced. The mesh is referenced, meaning you can't grab it. Then G is also color coded, and it's the bones are set to reference, the mesh is set to reference. This is the floor. And next, so I'm gonna start with R. Here's R. As you can see, it's a separate self-containing group, right? It's very clean. And you know what? Maybe I'll just name it. I like this better. There, nice. RIG, right? And I'm gonna show over here. Everything's locked out. This is the group, right? This is the group. Everything's locked out. Everything is zeroed and 1, and then visibility, right? Yeah, and then if I press H, now you can see it, right? And if I just click on it once, you see the top level, I mean the next level down, I have my R letter, and you can see here everything is zeroed out, and there's no data. There's no data at all. Over here, I got my delta mesh, right, for the mesh. Next thing is down here, this is make sure this is yellow. If you don't have yellow over here for the delta mesh for its scale, that means you forgot to do the connection editor, where you do the connection editor between the delta mesh, its specific XYZ scale attributes, where it's connected via the connection editor to the global control, right? So right now I have the global control selected, and surprisingly, under its outputs, it has the delta mesh plugged into it. So again, this is the global controller, not the mesh. The global controller has an outputs value, and it's also yellow, meaning connection editor connection. Okay, so I gotta set this back to 0. I had some animation. I also set this. Right. Don't worry about this. I was doing some test animation. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so the letter R mesh, delta mesh, skin cluster, meaning it's skinned, right? Delta mesh. Side note, if your rig, right, let's say this, and this, right? I'm gonna twist it a bit like that. Now, so far it looks fine, right? I'm testing out the rig, and I animated the controllers, not the bones, right? If for whatever reason if the rig is kind of getting ugly, like this is still acceptable, you know. But I want to share something. I've shown it with the other recent tutorials, but when I select the mesh, R, mesh, delta mesh, the smoothing iterations, it's in my PDF I mentioned to set to 40, but you can increase this to 100 and it can smooth it out. See? But there's still some, see, it smooths it out, but other areas starts to get all jacked up, like over here. So it's a give and take. You know, over here, smoothing iterations, if I drop it down to 40, remember this part. See? But then other parts might get a little bit more, well, anyhow. So you could, you know, worst case scenario, if the mesh is kind of still acting up, you could experiment and set that to like, I don't know, like 100, maybe 125. I've shown it for the letter I, that you could do that. But anything more than that, it starts to get weird artifacts, as you've seen over here. So if I go in here, and instead of 100, if I set to like 70, so wait, over here is a little bit smoother, right? But over here starts to see artifacts. So it all depends on the letter. It all depends on the letter. I'm just pointing that out. But 40 is like the sweet spot in a way. Anyway, so that's 7 minutes already. Then my empty group organizer, okay? And my empty group organizer, you notice there's no data either. You know what, let me set my bones straight. I'm in my controllers. So I grabbed all of it, then clear it out. Okay, then my empty group organizer, there's no data, right? Assuming that this is not moved and stuff. Because if I move this, and if I rotate this is my global controller. But now my empty group organizer has some data, which is fine, because you know it has this data in there. So if I set my global back to normal, then my empty group organizer is also back to normal. Right? So don't panic if there's information in your empty group organizer, just as long as your global control is also zeroed out. Right? The moment you put stuff, movement, values, right, for your global controller, your empty group will start to see this. But at its default value, or when everything's zeroed out for your global controller, your group should also be clean like this, right? That I want to differentiate that. And then, so at this default value, baseline, right? This should be like this, and it should be blue. Blue meaning it's constrained. But I have a parent constraint with the translate XYZ, and also the rotations constraint and the scale constraint for my empty group organizer. My scale is constrained. Your empty group organizer, it needs to have the scale XYZ constraint. No other controller should have scale XYZ constraint. I repeat, no other controller, like the center of gravity, should not be constrained. But the global controller should have, the empty group organizer, its scale should be constrained. And just to remind, What is it constrained to? What are all these things for my empty group organizer constrained to? It's constrained to my global controller. Because my global controller, like I described in my other tutorials, it's driving the empty group organizer, which is all blue. And what is inside of my empty group organizer, right? My empty group organizer has my root joint, and within that has the side chain, right? And this right here, root joint parent constraint, right? You should have that. What is this constrained to? Well, so the root joint, see, goes up to the root joint, this constraint, and the root joint is now constrained to my center of gravity. So if I do this to my center of gravity, right, see these values, if I grab my root joint, you'll see the same values. See? So if I grab my root joint, here it is, and the root joint has constrained XYZ translate and XYZ rotate, but not my bones. I mean, not my XYZ scale, the root joint. There's no constraints on the scale like I mentioned before. But if I look at my controller, oh, there's a slight offset. Interesting. Controller here, my root joint, slightly different. I think this comes from the initial placement when I first put this. That's why over here is slightly different. These two, which is fine. So I grab my center of gravity, COG, zero it out, go back to here, grab my root joint, and my root joint only has these two values. These two values, what they mean is when I first placed the big root joint in the 3D scene. So when I first placed it right here, this is the values it calculated based off of the grid. Like 0, 0, 0 is here. So when I placed the big joint, root joint, it went up Y 4 units. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5. See? 4.5 units up. And it went negative 1 and 1.037 units towards my left. Towards my left is this way, and a little over 1.3, so it's right there. So those are what these values mean. So I'm just explaining what those are. It's not supposed to be all zeroed out. It's not. There's going to be some values for your joints and the X and the Y because we were placing it. For example, if I go create skeleton, create joints, right? And let's say if I place one right here, you'll see that it'll be 0, 0, 0 for the translate XYZ. I'm going to hold X, plop it there. See? Joint 1, all 0. But the moment I move it, see it has its values, right? That's why there's some, you see some values for your joint. But your rotations should see no values. Your rotation should have no values. This is, if you have rotations in your joint, something went wrong. Anyway, so that's what that is. All right, so you got your joints, right? And then your center of gravity. My center of gravity right now, I have the scale XYZ and the visibility locked out, okay? And then my double-sided controller, right? Double-sided controller right here. This one, depending on what I want to do, this one I only have it set to rotate, right? I don't want to yank on it. That's why it's locked out with the translate XYZ, locked out the scale for sure. You know what, let me lock out my visibility too. I select it and I lock. And then say this one is locked out, and it's already locked out for here. And then say for example down here where I want to be able to pull, you notice it's not locked out here, but it's locked out on my scale. Let me lock out my visibility too. Main theme is make sure XYZ scale is locked out and the visibility. Some of these I forgot to lock them out. This one's locked out. This one's not. See, this one's locked out. So depending on your situation. Press G. Oops. No. Lock. Yeah. Lock. Lock. See? Everything's clean, locked out. Locked. Locked. Oh, I didn't lock this one. And this one, I have it be able to stretch. So that's why this one is not locked out. I want it to rotate and pull. This one too, I want to rotate and pull, but I want to lock out my visibility. This one, I need to lock out my visibility. This one, I need to lock out my visibility. But I can pull and move, see? Pull and rotate. So depending on the rig, but for sure you want scale XYZ and visibility locked out, these three. Okay. So, and there should be no values. There should be absolutely no values in here. If you have values in your animation controllers, unfortunately you do have to redo them. You have to unparent it and you have to redo it. And you also have to redo the constraints if there's values in here. You have to basically kind of start from scratch in terms of the parenting. You have to freeze the transforms on your controllers, and then you also have to unparent them. From what I remember, what I did, you have to carefully unparent them and then unfreeze them. I mean, you have to freeze them after you unparent. And the constraints, you also have to redo the constraints for at least you know, several chains up. Sometimes it's just best to redo the entire constraints, right? All the constraints is best to just wipe them out. I mean, that's usually the safest thing to do. Because you could think to yourself, oh, and let me just wipe out just some of the problematic constraints, right? And leave the other constraints alone. It may be okay, but it may also not be. It's a little bit tricky. Like, I've ran into that, and the best thing I did was just wipe out the entire constraints and redo them to avoid any hidden booby traps. Yeah. So, and also your controllers, none of your controllers should have anything like blue colored. None of your controllers. That means that your controllers got constraints on them, meaning that received constraints. So none of your controllers should have blue. Whereas your joints, right, they'll have blue. But none of your joints, right, none of your joints should have constraints on the scale. None of them. Absolutely none of them should have constraints on their scale, which is, see, nothing. No constraints on the scale. Alright, so that's like 20 minutes. And that's pretty much everything, right? Talked about the joints, talked about the controllers, the global controller as well. right? The global controller, nothing should be locked out. Nothing should be locked out on your global controller. Nothing. Even the visibility should be left on. Visibility, you know what? Yeah, don't lock the visibility either for the global controller. Yeah. Okay. And then if I were to scale my global controller, you see it'll look normal. See, it'll look normal. Reason why it looks normal, and reason why it will not look normal, is because the mesh, right? When I scale the global controller to like 15, 15, right? The global controller and the scale. If you notice on my mesh, if I click on my delta mesh, this also says 15, right? It's because my scale is dynamically linked and communicating with the meshes, delta mesh, scale, controller, delta mesh, 15, 15. So all of that, double check for all of that. Yeah, and that's about it. And I imported all the letters, right? You see, I'm gonna hide that. Right? See, everything is here.